During this Lenten Bible study, we are looking at 6 parables that Jesus taught in his last week here on earth. The first 3 we looked at were the parable of the 2 sons, the parable of the wicked tenants, and the parable of the wedding feast, which were all directed at the religious leaders, pointing out how they had failed to lead Israel and uphold God's word. The next 3 parables we will look at are directed toward the disciples and you and I. Jesus and the disciples had been at the temple, and as they were leaving, Jesus asked them, "Do you see all of these things?" Meaning the temple and the buildings. Then he said, "I tell you the truth, not one stone will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." He then led them to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately, and they said, "Tell us, when will this happen, and what will be a sign of your coming at the end of the age?" Jesus proceeded to teach them about what it will be like when he returns, including 3 parables, the first of which is today's parable of the 10 bridesmaids. I like to camp, and one of my favorite ways of camping is jumping in a canoe and heading down the river and pulling off along the water while setting up camp for the night. One year, my Boy Scout troop did just that. We got up early, we drove to our drop-off point, carried everything down to the water, and began to load our canoes. My best friend and I then pulled out our rope and began tying everything in. We had a short piece to tie to the front of the canoe for pulling and a larger piece of rope to secure our gear. If any of you are canoers or have done any long or rough floats, you know that after you put all your gear in the canoe, you take the rope and crisscross it back and forth across the canoe through any bag handles or loops and around the ribs of the canoe, creating a mesh netting so that if you flip your canoe, you don't lose all your gear. Right before we pushed off, some of our friends saw our canoe and they realized they had forgotten to bring the rope to secure their gear and asked if they could have some of our rope. And we said no, not because we were being jerks, but because we only had enough rope for our canoe. So we pushed off, and things went well for the first several hours. But sure enough, those guys in that other canoe flipped over and all their stuff fell out. We rescued them first, then the canoe, but all of their stuff either sank to the bottom of the river or floated away. About an hour and a half later, we came across a farmhouse off in the distance, and they allowed these guys to call home. They waited there for a ride home while the rest of us went on to enjoy the canoe trip. Those 2 guys had forgotten the Boy Scout motto to be prepared, and they paid the consequences. There are 5 young ladies in our parable today who could have benefited from the Boy Scout motto as well. Jesus is on the Mount of Olives with his disciples, and as he told them very plainly that no one knows about the day or hour when I will return, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Jesus explained that when he returns, it will be like the flood in Noah's day. It will be swift and sudden. He says that at the time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 bridesmaids who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Last week, we talked a little about weddings in the first century. We learned that they usually lasted 7 days. Last week's wedding was a royal wedding, but this week's parable is about a common wedding, a community wedding. They still lasted 7 days, but unlike a royal wedding where the attendance was by invitation only, a common wedding was for the whole community. And unless you were very disliked or a flagrant sinner, you were invited. And 2 invitations were still given. The first invitation was presented by a crier who would go throughout the streets announcing that the wedding was being planned. Then on the morning of the wedding day, the crier would go around again, announcing that the feast was ready and the groom would be coming soon. All day long, there would be dancing and singing and drinking and eating. It was a huge celebration. And the actual wedding was then held soon after dark. But no one knew exactly when the groom would be coming. But they knew that they needed to be prepared. When the groom did eventually arrive, the people would flood into the street to meet him, and they would parade to the bride's home. Once there, a ceremony would take place, and After the ceremony, they would then parade to the groom's home for a week of festivities. Now, because the bride did not know when the groom's preparations would be completed, she kept a veil and a lamp next to her bed so that she would be ready to go at a moment's notice. The same was true of the bridesmaids. Once they heard that the groom was coming, they were to get dressed and ready for the wedding and to wait for the groom to come by and pick them up. However, in this case, the groom is delayed in arriving. Why? We aren't told. But the reason for the delay is unimportant. What Matthew wants us to understand is that the groom is unexpectedly late, and it's now near midnight. We are told that there are 5 wise bridesmaids and 5 foolish bridesmaids. The invitation to the wedding has been issued, and the fact that all 10 bridesmaids are waiting for the groom indicates that all 10 know of the groom and had accepted the invitation. They are waiting for him to come by, and they can't wait to be led to the wedding banquet, to heaven. Now, some of the wise and some are foolish, not necessarily in terms of wanting to go to the wedding, but rather in terms of being prepared to go to the wedding. We are told that the bridesmaids fall asleep, all 10 of them, wise and foolish alike. But note, none of them are chastised for or rebuked for falling asleep. Sleep here must not be seen as anything other than physical sleep. The issue here isn't sleep, but being spiritually prepared. The difference is, when they awake, the wise are ready to go. The foolish, however, wake up unprepared. So according to this parable, at midnight, a time no one would have expected, the crier announces that the groom is coming, and they all wake up. Because they were prepared and ready, the wise had oil for their lamps, and they trimmed them. But the lamps of the foolish quickly went out. So the foolish bridesmaids asked to borrow some oil from the wise, to which the wise replied, "We're sorry, but we can't. There's not enough for all of us." Now, at first, maybe we think they're being mean or uncaring, but not so. It's like my friend and I with our rope. We needed all the rope we had to secure our gear. If we had cut our rope in half or given any of it to our friends, then some of our gear would have been left unsecured and vulnerable to being lost. The wise bridesmaids knew that they had to walk to the bride's home and then back to the groom's home, and they would need all the oil that they brought. The wise maids do empathize and even suggest that the foolish ones quickly run and try to get some more oil before the groom gets there. And that's what they do. However, while they're gone, the groom arrives, takes the wedding party to the feast, and locks the door. The 5 foolish bridesmaids eventually arrive, but they find that the door is shut. Not only did they miss the parade, but the wedding as well. Further, they missed the most critical part of a Jewish wedding, when the bride was taken into the groom's home under the wedding canopy. And finding the door locked, they begged, "Sir, sir, open the door for us." But all they heard were the dreaded words, "I tell you the truth, I do not know you." So what does all this mean? Well, Jesus began by saying the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins or bridesmaids. Again, the son represents Jesus. The wedding is Jesus' reconciliation with his church. And what is the church? We are the church. His delay is the time between his death and his return, but it is this delay that causes some to be unprepared. It has been 2,000 years, and Jesus is still delayed in coming, and some have become bored. They've become indifferent and complacent. But this is more than just that they've stopped watching for his return. The foolish bridesmaids were watchful. They were out in the street waiting with the wise bridesmaids. So this is more than just remaining watchful. It's about keeping our lamps lit, meaning our lifestyles and our ministry must also be kept lit. Being prepared is more than just waiting. We must also be about the Lord's work. We must keep the candle burning. The foolish bridesmaids' lamps go out. And the verb that is used to tell us that their lamps went out is the same verb used in Proverbs 13:9 and Job 18:5, which tell us that the lamps of the wicked go out. Jesus may have used this verb specifically with these verses in mind. The foolish bridesmaids represent those who believe, but their faith isn't real. It doesn't produce any fruit and thus is false. The foolish are those who enjoy the benefits of the Christian community without a true love of Jesus. These people are hoping that their association with true believers, the wise, will get them entrance into the kingdom. Give us some of your oil. But as this parable points out, our salvation cannot be shared. Each of us must carry our own individual lamp to the wedding. Each of us is responsible for our own personal relationship with Christ and for our own works of ministry, our own oil. We can't ride on the coattails of others. We can't borrow oil from others. The fact that they found the door shut and the groom refusing to open it tells us that even though God is being extremely patient with us, there will come a time when it will be too late to make a decision of faith or to produce fruit, and no amount of crying or pleading will open the door. This rejection is not because they didn't desire to enter the banquet, they did, but rather they are rejected because they were not prepared and they did not have true faith. They said they wanted to go to the wedding, but they didn't prepare for it, and so are left in the dark. Jesus concludes this parable saying, therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. Therefore indicates Jesus' very important main point, that we must be prepared for his unexpected return, for we don't want to be caught unprepared. There are many people in our churches today who truly desire to enter the kingdom of heaven. They say they want to go, but they're not acting like they want to go. They're not preparing themselves spiritually for the coming of the groom. They become indifferent and complacent while they wait for Jesus to return. Instead of remaining watchful and preparing, they're living their lives the way they want to and for themselves. Their time is spent doing what they want to do and not necessarily what God has called them to do. Many say, I'll get to God's work soon, another day. They figure it's been 2,000 years. What are the chances Jesus will return in the next few days, weeks, even years? But this parable demonstrates that we don't know when the groom will return. He may come tonight. And if he does, are we prepared to go to the wedding? Do we have enough oil? My friends, choose this day whom you will serve. Peace and blessing.